welcome to the BPF webinar, Going Local, What's Next for the Places We Live. So my name is Linda Chandler. I'm Research Director and Head of Government Insights for the technology analyst firm IDC, and I'm delighted to be your host this morning. So this webinar is the latest in the series from the BPF and UKPA partnership, with the aim of helping both the memberships to navigate this somewhat different world that we find ourselves in post-COVID-19, and to look at the implications for the built environment. If you've missed any of the previous discussions, the recordings are available on the BPF website. So for today's session, we noticed that much had been said about the demands of a return to the workplace, but less about the possible effects on places and neighbourhoods. So we'll be considering how much changes around transport and shopping and services and other amenities affect how we live, and what are the implications for design, operation and management at that community level. We'll explore what role we might expect parties in the built environment, and that includes real estate owners and tech firms, and what role they might have across living and working, and what tools might be needed to enable this. And how might our buildings and communities we have already need to be repurposed to accommodate those changes? I'm joined by a very experienced panel today, and we'll be looking at these issues from different viewpoints. We have with us Nicky Wightman, and Nicky is the Director of Global Occupier Trends PropTech for Savills. Welcome, Nicky.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
We have Emma Frost, and Emma's the Director of Innovation, Sustainability and Communities at the London Legacy Development Corporation. And we have Josh Artus, and he is the Consultancy Director at the Centric Lab. Welcome, Josh. So please feel free to pose questions to the panel at any point during the webinar via the Q&A function, which you should find in the panel in Zoom. We'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll try to address them as we go along. And as a reminder, we are recording this webinar. So now I'd like to hand over to the panel to add to their introduction and also start with a provocation. And I'd like to ask each of them what they consider to be the main challenges facing cities and neighbourhoods coming out of lockdown. And Emma, I'd like to start with you to see what you're seeing at LLDC.
Good morning, everyone. I was trying to follow the rules by being on mute so that I didn't bleed into anyone else's audio. So I'm Emma. I work for the London Legacy Development Corporation. We are the public sector organisation that's responsible for the transformation and the management of Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford, East London, and that's after the 2012 Games and the huge regeneration effort, both in physical, social and economic terms, that has gone on in the area since 2012. So just to respond to Linda's provocation, I very much wanted to focus on big, broad challenge thinking, but also opportunities. I learned the other week that the Chinese word for crisis means danger and opportunity. And I think I'll use that to kind of take that lens, if you like, for my questions, to focus on both the challenges and, more importantly, the challenges that we can also see as opportunities. So the first point that I would want to draw on is one of scale. So lockdown shrunk everyone's geography by virtue of what we've been asked to do and what we have to do. We're now living at a neighbourhood and a community scale that we just haven't done since about the 1950s. And that's really important because of our sphere of influence on our social terms, on our economic terms, and on our immediate environment terms. And I think the importance of genuinely understanding the human scale of urban planning and city making is being rediscovered. And I think that's a critical kind of step forward in how we think about urban development going forward, and what some of the challenges that will be expressed and some of the opportunities that can be expressed in urban development over the next few years as we think about the changes post-COVID. It's interesting to think of the park, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, as a lens for this, because essentially the park is a city within a city. So for those of you that don't maybe know it, it's based in Stratford, East London. It's the kind of confluence point between 4 boroughs, Waltham Forest, Newham, Tower Hamlets and Hackney. And a 25-minute walk can take you from one side of the park to the other. And that walk would take in public realm green space, water space, shopping centres, workspace, homes, international venues, play parks, coffee shops, makerspace, galleries, theatres, artist workshops, schools, unis, nurseries, an international business campus. You know, it genuinely does have a million different use cases all happening at the same time within a 25-minute walk net. So it's kind of got everything but the cathedral to make it the city classification. And that's why we think of it as a giant neighbourhood, a district, or a city within a city. And I think that's actually quite a useful lens, as I say, for us to think about the neighbourhood scale going forward and thinking of that more as a framework for urban design and development. So we may in the future see cities more as kind of connected concentric rings of real local communities, and we may have a deeper understanding of what that means when we think about planning, design and living in the local. And I know this is a theme that may well be picked up, the kind of 15-minute city concept later on. So I just wanted to start with that importance of scale and understanding and valuing the neighbourhood and the community scale. And related to that is the second point around partnerships, the role of partnerships and trust ties. And these are the things that build networks and resilience in communities. Now, we've all always known that, but what the pandemic crisis has illustrated is just how crucial those trust connections are. And at QEOP, we've seen that, sorry, that's Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. We've seen that particularly through things like the work that we've been doing in partnership with One Badu Community. So volunteering networks using whole youth volunteering in a sports outreach program that's completely flipped to become an amazing volunteer army distributing medical supplies, food banks, food supplies, youth mentoring, teaching online, a whole gamut of just incredible community response that's happened through trust networks and a local organisation working with the communities it knows inside out. We've also seen things like Bromley by Bow Centre and Poplar Harker coming together to develop their own testing and contact tracing mechanisms and tools, again, at that very, very localised and trusted level, which increasingly we may need rather than a sort of top-down government stronghold approach. I think one of the challenges, as we all know, is thinking around the kind of local economic stability, thinking again about like the high street. So pre-COVID, high street footfall was down about 63%. Everyone would assume that actually the COVID crisis might be the final nail in the coffin for the high street. But actually what we might start to see is that it's the radical shake-up that the high streets desperately needed. You know, if something's completely broken, sometimes you have to take it apart and start again. And I think that creates a new opportunity for high streets as well, and thinking about those sort of local economic systems and ecosystems. If we are working towards maybe not working from home, but working near home models, what does that do for kind of local economic activity? And how do we stimulate that in a really positive way by rethinking the cluster of uses and the actual planning uses that the high street might need to accommodate? I think with that is a linked opportunity to think about a lot of the innovation systems and cycles that we see, particularly around high-tech sectors or big growth industries like clean tech and a lot of advanced mobility work that's happening at the moment. We often think of innovation in the strongholds of the technological landscapes, but actually there's a massive opportunity to translate a lot of that innovation learning to the foundation economy or the everyday economy and link it into the different activities that we see on high streets. And that again ties back to some of the examples I was using before about the way that a lot of our local businesses and communities have pivoted. They've done a complete 180. They've been incredibly innovative in the way that they've responded. There are lessons there about organizational management. There are lessons there about sprint psychologies and how we embed some of that in the foundational economy, in the everyday economy, and how we translate some of those learnings back again to the more high tech and big business corporate economies as well. I think that there will be huge challenges around mobility. I'm not the first person to say this at all, but the way that we move people and goods is going to be critical as we emerge out of lockdown. I think the focus actually is going to be less on how safe and secure the individual spaces or offices are, because they're relatively easy to manage, not easy, relatively, but the real challenge will be how do we get to and from those spaces. And for us, I see a massive opportunity in smart mobility and particularly active travel within that. So we're doing a lot of work looking at how people can use pedal power, running, walking, e-cargo bikes, electric bikes, autonomous vehicles, all of this work we'd started to pilot on the park anyway, but how can we now throw heightened energy and attention to that? Again, thinking about the neighbourhood scale, and how can we try and share some of that learning and share some of the data that's extracted from that big kind of data management to understand what the new opportunities might be around micro or hyper-local active travel. I think with all of this, we need to be crucially aware of the digital divide. And again, COVID has exacerbated and exaggerated a lot of the inequalities and the issues that we always knew were there, but it has made it so much worse and it has blown them apart. So the digital divide is something that I know we're all very aware of, but it will actually increase unless we actively do something about it. And because of how much is transitioning online and how quickly, not everybody has access to the facilities and the skills that they might need to be able to access all these new things that are going online. So really recognizing what we do about the resource and the talent and the skills pipeline in digital engagement is a big factor that we need to be aware of in urban planning, but also in the way that we live and the way that we operate. So there are some broad brush highlights to kind of kick off discussion. The park is really interesting, as I said, because we've always been working at that neighbourhood scale, and because we have a lot of these prototypes and a lot of these examples in place already. We are now positioning ourselves as an urban testbed and thinking about how we can be a real-time, real-life prototype centre for a lot of these urban adaptations that we're going to need to see, whether it's in smart mobility or whether it's in supporting local enterprises and community organisations to flip business models. So there's a lot more. Please watch this space over the next few months and years, but we would love to work more broadly with other partners and other players to see how we can pull together to learn from this crisis.
Thanks so much, Emma. You covered a really wide range of topics there, and again, touching on some of the digital divide and actually how digital might help us as well. Thanks for that. And Josh, I wonder whether we can come to you now, and I guess you're coming from perhaps more an urban health viewpoint. So again, the same provocation, what are the main challenges that you see facing cities and neighbourhoods coming out of lockdown?
Cool. Well, first of all, thanks for having me this morning. I think the answer in 3 words is responsibility, humility, and empathy. I think those are the challenges that we face as practitioners in this industry. I think the main reason being, I think we're, it's to no direct fault, but this webinar is consisting of 4 white people in a very white-dominated middle-class industry. And it's quite important that we start to address things by understanding that everyone has a different baseline. And that means actually taking responsibility and understanding some of the wrongs that have existed through historic inequalities or even things such as systemic racism. The reason I picked those 3 words when I think about something like responsibility is that, and I think what Emma was saying is actually part of my points, is that the private sector needs to understand actually how to take ownership of the sort of the wider public realm. And it doesn't mean actually owning land, but it's, how do private owners, new developers, housing associations help create civic stewardship of the commons? Private companies have great agency in economies of scale, from lawyers to designers, that often local communities don't. And with that lens, urban placemaking isn't just about putting on food markets, it's responding to what's going on and understanding how to really make life better. And I think that's that key lens. It's not what you do, it's what you add and the problems that you solve. And I think COVID is highlighting those problems that have existed. I think we need to have a lot more sort of humility and empathy, that realizing that sort of, back to normal for many sort of white collar workers means leaving behind what is often many people's normal. And the big awakening, as Emma was saying, is that, our health and what our health and well-being looks like when the factor of mobility is taken away, and that for many people will remain. And I think we need to take this on board and really ask those questions about, when we're creating places, to do much more community analysis on how does someone go for a run. If we have all these narratives of like, let's have a healthy city, is it even possible for someone to run in their community, to go for a walk, let alone the the athleisure gear that's needed, but are the surfaces there? Can you actually run for 2 kilometers without nearly being hit by a car? These are the type of questions that we need the private sector to work more effectively within it, with a willing public sector. The reason this relates to our work, so as briefly mentioned, I'm a co-founder of a business called Centric Lab. We are a research lab looking at the intersection of health, climate change, and cities. What that means is understanding through the lens of neuroscience how things like stressors, so air pollution, noise pollution, that's an environmental stressor, but also like a psychological stressor, how they create sort of a different urban footprint for people. So, and what that matters on their biological and mental systems. And we've developed our own software and frameworks to do that. I'm the only non-scientist in the team, so I did what my father told me, was work with people smarter than you. And an output of some of the research that we do, for example, is looking at the correlation in London between what we're calling those stressors, so a very sort of accurate scale using open data of the amalgamation of noise pollution, light pollution, heat pollution, things that we know will make our body overstressed. And we all experience stress, but some of us experience it in a chronic way, and a biologically chronic way, that it starts to throw off your system. Now start adding in the more sort of social stresses, whether it be things like housing insecurity, income insecurity, deaths in the family, all these other factors, they correlate to what we term as something called biological inequality as a result of the sort of urban environment. And we did a study on the relationship between the prevalence of these stresses, including deprivation, the sort of BAME population of London, and the rate of BAME deaths in London as a result of COVID. And the correlation is very, very high. And, there's nothing to do with genes or anything like that. Cut us all open and we're all the same. What our team were really hard and focused on working through is actually articulating that this is due to systemic, long-term and chronic exposure to factors such as those stresses that cause a person's system to be weakened and more susceptible to viruses and other illnesses, and maybe they pass it down a generation. And so what our lab is really focused on doing is taking the conversation of public health out of this broad ephemeral world of epidemiology. And that's not to say that their work isn't valid, but to put it in the hands of urban planning and understand the maybe not causational, but the almost beyond doubt correlation factors, to really understand us that urban planning is healthcare. And it's time for us to actually address these sort of systemic problems and take these responsibilities. And that's what our legacy should be. Money can be made, but not at the cost of someone's health. And that's not a price that I'm willing to pay. So I think our challenge here is understanding our own vulnerability, to accept other people's vulnerabilities, to take on that people have different susceptibilities. And we have to understand people's urban footprints very differently, because if we're going to rise from this better, we need to do it as a collective. So mine is a slightly more sort of social based mission. I'd say all the tech and the tools and the voices are out there. We actually have to get much smarter at how we be more inclusive about the type of problems we're trying to solve with what we're doing with a ton of money, a ton of brain power, a ton of political will. And it's time to be, I think, leaders in this industry and not just kind of think on our own backs. So I'll stop there, and I hope that explains a little bit of why we care about the public realm, the cities, our urban systems, transport inequality, access to greater equity of the commons, and also from a very pure business sense, as the future of work goes very much more into the higher cognitive tasks, what happens outside of the office will impact what happens inside. And until we factor that, you're not going to have productive and high performing people. So it's in everyone's best interest that we start to understand the space in between is as important as what goes on inside.
Thanks very much then, Josh, for that interesting viewpoint about taking public health into urban planning. I really like that. And so we come to Nicky. So in your role at Savills, looking at global occupier trends, I'd be really interested to hear what you believe are the main challenges facing cities and neighbourhoods coming out of lockdown.
Thanks. So my role sits in the Savills business across commercial offices business, the residential and leisure and retail. So I've got this kind of helicopter view at different parts of the market and the economy. So I guess so much we could talk about today, but I'm going to focus down just on a couple of areas. So I want to think a little bit about this piece about living and working and neighbourhoods, and then I'll talk a little bit about the broader city issues. So just really starting with that notion of living and working. A lot of my early work in Savills was working with technology innovation businesses. And I think it's fair to say that within some of those sectors, there was already this very much this flexible approach to where people worked, people very digitally enabled, and sort of taking that point that not all work happens like that, not everyone is digitally enabled. But for organizations that were, I think the nature of the workplace was already, there was already this sense that if you know that people can potentially work anywhere, they don't necessarily need to come to a physical place. For some organizations, spaces were being created very much with this notion of how do you create a space that people genuinely really want to come to? Or, you know, how do we interact? How do we encourage people to come and actually be physically present? So I think before COVID, that was already happening for some organizations and for some individuals. COVID has obviously put us in this situation where we've been accelerated and fast forwarded into this place where all organizations have now had to go through that experience. And I think it's fair to say that for some, that's been pretty challenging. They didn't necessarily have the digital infrastructure in place. Perhaps they, the sort of the nature of the business hasn't necessarily lent itself to working more remotely, more flexibly, more digitally. And I think for some organizations, there has been this sense of perhaps a lack of trust of if you're not physically in a workplace, perhaps you are not, you're not as productive as you might be. We as an organisation, I think along with many others, have done lots of, you can imagine, lots of work in this space. Our What Workers Want programme, our new Office Fit programme means that we've spent a lot of time both previously and now trying to understand this kind of piece about where and how people work. And I guess the overriding sense that we're seeing about work is this sense that the working digitally, working flexibly, has been well responded to. There's been this sense that people have adapted. And one of, I think, the key things that we're seeing is this embracing of this work-life balance, this ability to reclaim parts of your life, I guess, that perhaps you weren't previously experiencing, even though the situation obviously has been incredibly difficult. So, post-COVID, I guess, what are we expecting to see? Well, for some people, I guess, this maintenance of some of your time working flexibly, working digitally in a home environment. So I think that provokes lots of quite interesting questions about what are we now expecting from a work environment, and also what do we expect from our home environments, and what do we expect from our neighbourhoods as a result of that. I think if we think a little bit about work environments to begin with, one of the questions we're now all asking is, what is the point of a work environment? If we know that we can work digitally, we know that we can work remotely, if we're going to go into a work environment, what is the point of that? What is the functionality of that? Perhaps the work environment now is somewhere that is much more about going to work to really re-engage with your organization, to re-engage with your colleagues, to collaborate, to be creative. So the nature of what that work environment is about, I think, was already changing. We were already seeing much of this happening, but it's been accelerated through this process of COVID. So really thinking through, I guess, if you're a landlord, you're a developer, really beginning to think through, what does a workspace really look like now? What do you need it to do to be this place that people genuinely want to come to? I think that's incredibly important to think about. The language, I think, now really about work is, we're hearing a lot about this notion of hybrid, a hybrid life between work and working at home, working in an office, working in a workspace, and working at home, this hybrid world, and choice. This notion of incredibly more choice about hopefully where we will get to work in the future, all of which I think is interesting, all of which lends itself to what does the design of a workplace look like. We're obviously doing lots of thinking about what a great workplace now would look like to encourage people to want to come there. The second part of this, I guess, is the living piece. I think what does a home now look like? we're all experiencing this notion of trying to work from home. And I think we're increasingly going to need to think about a space that functions for all the things that we would do in a home space, but also what would a workspace look like at home. So from a technology point of view, what does a digitally enabled home look like? How would we think about technology resilience? How do we think about security? How do we think about design for homes so that people can comfortably and happily work in a home environment? How do we think about acoustics? How do we think about lighting? How do we think about community at home? If we're going to spend more time in these home working environments, what does that look like? In this new hybrid world, you know, what parts of our life will happen in a work environment? What happens in a home environment? So for example, if you think over the last few years, for many developers, many landlords will have thought about, how do I integrate perhaps kind of health, well-being, gyms, facilities into workspaces? I guess the question now is, how much of that happens in a workspace, and how much of that do we want to see in our home spaces? So I guess on a broad level, we've definitely seen over the last few years this notion of, within real estate, an attempt, not always done brilliantly, but an attempt to really understand what now customers, consumers want out of real estate. They want out of space. And I guess I would say it's never been more important than to now really genuinely try to understand what it is that people want out of physical spaces, whether they're home spaces, whether they're workspaces. And there's going to need to be a lot of listening to what people are saying that they really want. And I guess in the immediacy, there's this whole piece about, what do people want in terms of safety? How do you create spaces that feel safe for people to return to? Which is clearly, you know, the most important thing on everyone's mind right now. And beyond that safety piece, which feels immediate and probably longer term, how do you create spaces that blend this feeling of security and safety, but also have a point to being physically present? And therein lies the challenge, I think. You know, if we see the notion, well, you've touched on retail. If you think about what's happened in the retail space, we've seen retail move to this sense of trying to understand that a physical space needs to really be an experience. It needs to have a function. It needs to genuinely be a place that people want to come to. And I think across all real estate now, we have this challenge of the physical nature of real estate needs to operate on this level where people need to really want to be there. There needs to be a reason to be there. There needs to be an experience. It has to be a place you want to go. The challenge is, how do you create these places that people want to go to, but also are safe to go to? And how do you get that balance right? And I think that's a really important question right now for real estate. And then just briefly, touching at a city level, I've been involved in the development of the Savills Tech Cities programme. So for a number of years now, we've looked at the trends in global cities, the relationship between the technology and the creative sector and cities, and what has that looked like. And we've looked at lots of different thematics. We've looked at health and well-being on a city level. We've thought about city buzz and vibrancy on a city level. And more latterly, in the last cohort of cities, we were looking at transit and mobility and transportation. I think it's fair to say, as we move into looking at our next cohort of cities and we revisit all the work we've done, everything is now in the light of COVID. You know, every lens we use will have a COVID lens applied to it. And I guess, you know, on the basis that the last cohort of cities, we were thinking about transit and mobility. And other speakers, Emma and Josh, have begun to pick up on this notion of transit. It strikes me as enormously important to really begin to think through this relationship between real estate, transit, mobility. It's a space from a technology point of view, I've been incredibly interested in for a long time. I think the problems to solve in transit are such that it has attracted a really important, interesting conversation, and companies and individuals who are really trying to solve those problems. And never more, I think, are we going to see that focus on transit. Whatever happens in a workspace or on the high street, if people can't travel there safely, it's not going to happen very easily. And I think, you know, the COVID lens has very much demonstrated for us where transit sits on this city level. And I think feeling positive, you know, a bit like this sense of, you know, how can we take something positive from this? You know, how will workspaces be better? How will homes be better? How will communities be better? How will transit be better? I think one of the things I'm genuinely really excited about is, as we see cities try to open up and to be safe places to be, this movement to pedestrianisation, to cycling, to the creation of hard infrastructure to genuinely facilitate that. I feel it is a positive. There's a small positive we can take here. I think architects talk a lot about how, you know, historic events shape our cities, and we're already beginning to see that new shaping around this urban infrastructure to facilitate pedestrians and cyclists, which I hope just really triggers this new conversation about mobility on a city level.
Well, I mean, there's such a wealth of perspectives there. I'm a technologist, and actually I have to say that I agree with all of those points, and I'm seeing them from the viewpoint of, you know, the tech vendors and the technology community. We're seeing all of this. I think what's really interesting to pick up on this kind of mobility and transportation point, as we say, you know, there's always been people in latter years that have worked very flexibly. But I think now with this acceleration, we're seeing the late majority kind of come onto this where they can. And I think we're really starting to see digital come of age as a transport mode. We talk about this hyperlocality, and actually we've almost taken the city scale down to our home at the moment, and we're dining in the kitchen restaurant, and we're entertaining ourselves in the lounge, and we're working from the bedroom table or something like that. And so we're kind of moving around, but actually transporting ourselves into those worlds digitally. And I don't think that actually transport operators have really seriously thought about the alternative and actually digital as a mode, which I think is really, really interesting. But what I'd like to pick up on is this the kind of this norm that we've now started to settle on in terms of work and home life to take place in different contexts. And actually we've touched on the workplace, and we've touched on this kind of traveling to work. And Emma, you mentioned about, you know, work becoming more local, and how do we actually enable that? So what kind of working patterns and arrangements do you think we might see in the future as we start to come out of our homes? And I think initially I'll put that to Emma, but it'd be great to have a discussion about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Nicky and Josh, please feel free to jump in, because I know you guys will know just as much more on this as me. But we've been having some really interesting conversations about this concept of not really working from home, as everyone's seeing the limitations of that now. You know, it's really been stress tested quite rapidly and radically, but working near home. And this idea that maybe we won't see people commuting into central London or to big city centres for one single office HQ, and that we might actually start to see people finding spaces around their neighbourhood, whether it's on the high street or somewhere else, where they become designated kind of drop spots to go and work, but in a very planned and well thought through way. So as an example, you know, we've had some approaches. Well, actually, I was talking to, I live in Kingston, and in Kingston, there's been some approaches about vacant units on the high street from office or organisations thinking about, could there be a change of use to office? So they could almost have like a hub and spoke model, and they could have designated workspace for clusters of their employees that maybe live within the Southwest London area. And so just starting to think like that, it really gets your mind going about, okay, so how could the nature and form of the high street change to step into this opportunity? Because as I said before, it was already on its knees, and really we're seeing retail completely reevaluated. You know, the sort of general consumer high street pattern has shifted massively, and that we're unlikely to reverse full scale from that, because once people do adopt online shopping and other things, and once people's, as we said, kind of safety and health fears take over, then we're going to see consumer habits and retail habits change, probably permanently. So we need to be rethinking the wholesale, like what does the high street need to be and how does it function like that? There are planning kind of use case considerations there. There are design terms, there are management terms, there's enlivenment kind of cultural activation terms. There's also, you know, how much residential do we blend into retail, and what's the sort of civic role versus the consumer role, you know, and how do we find a different balance of powers and activities in those neighborhood centers? So I think just accepting, which is an assumption, you know, this is all assumptions at this stage from all of us, but if we take the assumption that we may not see en masse people traveling large distances to one main space of centralized employment, but rather we might have this more hub and spoke model of companies, businesses working a blend of remote home working with near home working, and then coming in for maybe one-off, as you said, Nicky, more kind of social engagement, workshop, team kind of collective thought work rather than no desk space. You know, who's going to want to fork out high-end real estate for just individual desk space? I don't think they will. So if we accept that that might be a direction of travel, what does that then mean for how we design and plan and shape and live in our local centres and our local economic recovery? I think that's really important. What can we stimulate if we've got more of people's downtime and spend time, work time and social time happening in the same area?
Yeah, I think, Emma, that's really interesting, and it's certainly, it picks up on a lot of things that I'm interested in at the moment. I mean, it strikes me that because of the situation we're in at the moment, we've got this kind of binary choice and this binary conversation happening between, you know, you're either in an office or you are at home, when in reality, for most of us before COVID, there was already this sense that you may be working in lots of different third spaces, for example. So I return to this notion of this sense of a menu, a hybrid of spaces, and movement away from this sense of an absolute between I'm somebody that goes into an office or I'm somebody that works at home. Most of us, I think, are going to, you know, where there's a choice, where there's an opportunity, where work lends itself to it, not, you know, recognizing not all work lends itself to this conversation. Not everyone has a choice. Where there is a choice, this opportunity to use lots of different touch points with work. From an organizational level, I think you know, we're definitely thinking about this notion of this hub and spoke. Organizations often want you to come to be part of a space for a number of reasons, so that you feel more connected to the organization, you feel more connected to your colleagues. And also I've heard people talk about recently, which I think is really interesting, for younger demographics of people who are just starting out on their work journey, work to some degree is something that you kind of learn how to do, and to some degree you learn that from other people that you work with. I slightly wonder, both in terms of home working and the work and the office working scenario, whether younger people look at this and think, you know what, actually, point one, I don't necessarily have a great home environment to be working from. And also, you know, I'm setting out on my work-life journey, I'm learning this. It's actually a really important time for me to be collaborating and being with my colleagues. So this opportunity to create some kind of space where people are enabled to do that, I think is really interesting. Does it, in CBDs, do we need to be traveling? Then probably not. No, having a much broader choice of spaces, as Emma says, seems really interesting right now.
Yeah, I just want to weave in a question there that we've got from Dan Gestico from our Iceni project. And he's saying, how do we use urban planning and design to close the increasingly obvious inequality between those with access to private gardens and home offices and those without? And these individuals, as Josh says, more susceptible to illness. So Josh, what's your feelings on this?
Yeah, well, it's the premise of what we do at Centric. Hi, Dan, by the way. Nice to hear from you. Two ways to look at it. We've obviously got retrofitting and new build. I think with retrofitting, it's the need to become far smarter about the materials and the materiality of what we put into our urban environments. And so we have to really diagnose environments to understand, you know, let's pick, for example, somewhere either like, so I'm going to be very London focused, but what's it called? Somerstown, adjacent to King's Cross in Euston, or somewhere such as Stockwell. And we can see that the areas are surrounded by high traffic A roads. There's high levels of air and noise pollution going through these areas. Yet as you go around the communities, you see there's very low sound dampening occurring. And so this is where we have to start thinking about design codes more effectively to look at the reduction of acoustic transfer in the public realm through materials that are more absorbent, and that is using wood. I mean, why are we creating buildings out of glass everywhere? Our high streets are the noisiest places they could be because sound is reflecting off every glass surface, and I respect that retailers try to advertise, but at the same time, you know, Amazon isn't killing the high street's killing us. Like I'm sure everyone on the panel here has gone to the high street at times and then come back and gone, oh, I never want to go out again. And it's sensorially and mentally, they are fatiguing places. And so when it comes to urban planning, we have to look at design codes from more of a health code point of view and what we're trying to solve. So I think that's a key one of retrofitting, is looking at the current baseline qualities of areas from the stressors and understanding, is this infrastructure resilient enough? From a new build, I think it's then going down the political line a little bit more. And I want to weave in a question that was asked just before by a lady called Jessica Nilsson about the idea of political will and to our workplace chat. So with regards to workplaces on the high street, yeah, like 100%, I spent a lot of time trying to look into this and have tried to do this in some forms. But the question we have to, or the field we have to navigate, is that over the past sort of 15, 20 years, the number of community and youth spaces has dramatically decreased among many communities and town centres. If all of a sudden we are going to sort of start dominating a high street with more expensive coffee shops, you know, these places already exist, but they're not just being used by the incumbent large organisations. We're just going to create more awkward inequality in this way. So what does political will look like? It looks like, actually, and I meant it more from, we've got governmental political will of build houses, build this, build that. That's part of our economy. Our responsibility has to come from within the industry to go, you know what, if we are going to do this, every new workplace that goes onto a high street needs to be set up as a community interest company, and it needs social impact metrics set against it to encourage those within their community to have a place to work. Because you know what, most of us are very lucky that we have a nice home to live in. I'm in a small one bed, it's fine, it's very easy for me, but there's a lot of people I've spoken to where there's 5-6 people to a home. Where can a kid go work? And you know, so do the uppers of these high street spaces get turned into after school spaces? And I think that's the responsibility that the industry needs to have from the inside, you know. And I'm just going to continue on my social bandwagon because this is an important point. This is what we need to acknowledge. You know, no one ends up clean when we're all playing in the mud. And you know, we've seen the stories going around all the property press and the main circulars about the scheme down in the Isle of Dogs being permitted through lobbying that meant the landowner could mitigate a £40 million community infrastructure levy bill or whatever it was. You know, it's our job to say no. Call it out, and we have to say, no, you can't do that because you're affecting my name and I'm trying to be responsible here. So I think that's a little mechanism of how we have to look at urban planning as a tool around good elements of governance, where we can use technology, where we can use but also take the responsibility of political will. And so if we are going to look at rejuvenating the communities that need it, we need to look at those levers to make sure that our community spaces coming back aren't just more, you know, £4.50 cappuccinos, and it's just a spread of people working, that we're a little bit smarter about it. So I hope I've kind of weaved together some perspectives there.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on, Josh, and that's kind of what I meant about you know, when the system looks like it's broken, it's definitely time to take it all apart and, you know, fix it better, build it back better. And we've got to do that on every level. So it's not just to focus on the economic return. Like, no longer should we ever be able to just consider an economic return. Like, we really have to find metrics and methods and that will, that political and the personal will, to really understand what the social and the environmental return has to be. You know, we've talked about triple bottom line economics and triple bottom line metrics a lot for the past decade and a half, but we've actually not instilled it, you know, and this kind of global pause and refresh moment should provide us for the chance to build back better and to rethink all of those structures, you know, whether it is, you know, what happens on a high street level and the business model form that they take, as well as the hours of use and the kind of mixed flexibility that has to be built in. Completely agree with all of that. The only way that we're going to see this sort of strong community rebuild is by thinking in that sort of triple bottom line way and genuinely applying it.
And I mean, it strikes me, I was just going to say that it strikes me that, you know, we knew before COVID that we were facing a climate emergency. We knew that there was this huge issue with mental health, for example. These are all the sorts of things we were talking about. And this period has escalated some of those things. It's shone a light on other parts of that. And clearly, you know, this feels, and I think the language of this feels like the time, then we try to find some positivity that comes out the other side of it, both for the things that we were seeing before COVID and the things that have been accelerated by it. And in terms of physical spaces, you know, these are all things that we were talking about already. But clearly now feels like the time, this kind of, you know, to do things better. That surely should be the focus right now for everyone. It's really important that we're not just always thinking about what's happening in London. Then I'm guessing, you know, we've got people listening from all sorts of different locations who are probably screaming at the screen saying, stop talking about London all the time. And I guess the challenges are going to feel, I mean, clearly challenges within different parts of London are going to feel different because London's such an enormous place, but the challenges that other parts of the UK, for example, will be feeling again are going to feel very different. I have to say, I would be cautious. I don't consider myself to be a sort of an expert on some of those kind of regional locations. And part of this, I think, is really about listening to people who have this expertise of their neighbourhoods, of their communities, and genuinely listening to people about what they say matters to them. I've been a big proponent from a technology point of view for quite a long time. I've thought it's interesting, the notion of crowdsourcing. You know, I know lots of cities around the world have used kind of crowdsourcing technology to really try and engage people, to listen to and to give people a voice and to use technology to kind of open up the conversation. And I think this point about how do you listen, how do you engage, how do you genuinely consult with people? I think for me, when we're talking about any area, wherever that is, that ability to not come with lots of preconceptions, but to genuinely listen to what a community is saying seems to me to be really important. And so I would say on a regional level, that's the first step, you know, genuinely engage, consult, listen to what people in that local community have genuinely got to say.
I'd just like to add, there's a great company in the United States on the West Coast called Streetwise, sort of YZE. And I think this is just in America because there's greater community pride than I've seen general across the UK, and I don't quite know why that is, but what people tend to do is kind of tag and spot a location in their community that needs adaptation. I think it's because of the economies of scale of North America that are slightly different, but it's in this way that a civic tool, and it's not a civic tool, but it's the private organization, is enabling citizens to have a voice in saying, hey, city council, hey, private businesses, you've never noticed, but this vacant lot is unnecessary. Could we turn it into a community garden? And so there's a combination of setting things like that up with other forms of sort of social governance, things like the Hull coin that has existed, a form of like local currency to encourage stewardship and ownership. And when we combine those with the new tools coming through, such as commonplace and built ID as a way of really, you know, geofencing to an area and really like helping getting voices out there, we do start to actually find where the technology is coming in to kind of solve those problems. I think those are, I'm sure there are tech people asking, what tech can I use? I think those are kind of like four good places to observe how to listen to an audience and let people say their voice. I think we go back to the private industry. Let's give people a voice. If we look at the streets rioting in North America right now, it's not just because of one death, it's because of decades and decades and decades of people saying, you've ignored us and you don't listen and you don't care. And I think, you know, we have to also think like this. That's, I think, how we're going to get through this and respond to this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredibly interesting. And I think technology has a part to play here. I mean, you know, there is definitely a role for technology in this facilitating, enabling, creating transparency. Um, but it's not it's clearly not the only solution, because, you know, as we've touched on earlier, not everybody feels digitally enabled. So I think it's super important to get the balance right between listening to people and giving them a technology voice, but for those who don't have it, making sure multiple ways of connecting with people. But ultimately, you know, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. I think, you know, this is a time to really listen to what people want, and whether you're in whatever sector you're in, what kind of stakeholder you are, whether you're coming at it from, you know, really commercial head on, you know, never has it been more important to genuinely listen to what people need you to do, and try to respond to that.
I think that's right. And it ties together, you know, valuing the local expertise and understanding that community intelligence, wherever it comes from. And it also links to Josh's beginning point about kind of inclusive design and practice. You know, how do we really kind of build a coalition of players that are rooted in place, that understand and return value to that place? And both of the comments that you were just chatting through, and then linked to one of the questions about 5G and how that might exacerbate or change kind of existing trends. I think they pick up on a project idea that we've just started on the park, which is actually about the concept of a kind of, we started off calling it an urban war room, but that kind of leads people down the wrong track. For the reason being, you know, if you think of a traditional Churchill style war room, it was the physical space where you had all your maps, all your diagrams, all your intel plastered over the walls, and you could do some proper submersive design solution building. So our concept is more of an urban ideas room, and it would be both physical and virtual, and it would be really rooted in the neighborhood. So we would be able to map everything, like from 3D model of the park and the surrounding areas to some of the kind of health indicators and the sensor technology that Josh was talking about that his company specializes in, to that really important, like, how do we engage? How do we actively bring people into debate and conversation, involve them in the trade-offs? Because essentially that's what urban design and planning is all about. It's trade-offs and understanding the kind of dynamic of placemaking on an iterative basis. So we are just starting this journey, working really closely with UCL, Bartlett and Real Estate Institute, and a number of other partners, to really seriously explore, could we do this at, again, that neighborhood scale, to build a kind of center, as I say, a digital world and a physical world, where anyone can come and really understand the dynamics that are in play in our city making and living. And I think that would be a really nice project to exemplify a lot of the points that we've been making this morning about the importance of listening, responding, iterative testing, data-led, informed kind of analytics that then help us improve our kind of social, environmental and economic returns. And crucially, that kind of inclusive approach to everything, whether it's design or operation or expanding opportunities and talent pipelines.
That's great. I mean, with regards to technology, you know, having kind of viewed this from the technology viewpoint for kind of 25 plus years, the technologists are always moving ahead and looking forward to the next thing. And society is just running at that much slower pace. And how do you think we really get on top of that? How do you think we really start to respond and empower people to embrace the technology?
I think the interesting thing about Cyborg Labs, if we, I mean, people will find a common theme with the way that I'm speaking about this, but you know, they came in with a very top-down approach, and I think people's ire is not being kept in the conversation of where technology is being applied, because it always feels that a new thing is coming along rather than an old problem being solved. I think it's as simple as that, is how we look at where the tech tools can be used. I think what's really interesting, there's a company that's been spun out of MIT, and they're called BioBot. And this is really gross what they do, but it started from a PhD researcher, and they were investigating the chemical composition of sewage. And through a lot of smart stuff, I have no idea how it truly works, but they were able to actually geographically track the sort of dietary makeup of the city, and they can start to use that as proxies towards health in this way. And this, in some weird way, is similar to what John Snow did at the discovery of cholera, that, you know, or sort of the identification of how cholera forms through infrastructure in that way, that when we're seeing this proliferation of AI and tools and 5G, is it just coming in the terms of drones, which I can't work out how drones are going to be flying above people's heads if you already understand the sensorial difficulties of navigating city centres. I just, you know, my one of my younger brothers, who's 19, but he's on the autism spectrum and he's very highly functional, but he does have a sensorial stimuli issue. And that London, he doesn't live in London, he doesn't study in London, he's at university now, but London is too much for him. And so now all of a sudden to have things flying around us, I don't think that's you know, great for delivering healthcare products, but to deliver someone's Amazon or their burger, I think grow up, seriously. The reason I bring that up is that you know, the idea of smart cities, we have the tools around it, but we also know what we should be solving. And I think it's getting smarter in looking at that better time, and there are good examples of real-time data on air pollution. How do we actually communicate that to people? How do we actually translate it? How do we help them build agency? I think that's where the tech conversation is disappearing down the controlled by private equity hedge funds who want to fund venture capital businesses the whole time. They exist, but that shouldn't be the dominating force in our urban landscape, because it's the commons and it should be understanding common issues.
And I just wonder if I can kind of sum up with some of the common themes that I've heard. Certainly, you know, for this topic about what's next for the places we live, I think this idea about inclusivity and inequality, how do we solve those problems that are there, and how do we come out of this situation in a very positive way? I think there's a lot around trust. I think there's a lot around trust of individuals, but collaboration and trust between organisations at that local level. And also I think there's a lot about the local economic recovery and really kind of focusing and doubling down on our communities and how we do this kind of bottom-up recovery, which is great. So I think all that remains for me is to thank you for your attention and your questions. I don't think we answered all of them, but we'll try to get back to those that we didn't. I'd like to thank our panelists for their great opinions and conversation this morning. And finally, our hosts, BPF and UKPA.